with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The word of the Lord. Some of the best stories in the Bible are about David, the shepherd boy, the musician, the poet, the warrior, Israel's greatest king. We don't look at David as an exemplary king just because of his long reign or his victories on the battlefield. Yes, those are important. But in David's story, the remarkable part is, when you think about all of the colorful characters in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, David is the one who feels the most like us, utterly human. Our connection with David starts with this story today, which begins with two armies at a standoff. These were agrarian tribesmen, so we're probably not talking about a huge battle, but probably more of a skirmish. The Philistines had two advantages over the Israelites. They had iron weapons, and they had an enormous warrior named Goliath. Now, imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger back in his Terminator days. But just think about 1.5 times bigger. King Saul wisely refused to let his army engage in battle with the Philistines because he knew they would get slaughtered. David, the baby, the family, had been sent by his father to bring provisions to his older brothers who were soldiers. So he enters the scene and sees the fear that has overcome the Israelites when Goliath taunts them. And then, in a series of remarkable events, David winds up being the one out on the battlefield who is brave enough to take on the giant. He doesn't want to wear the ill-fitting armor of the king. He only wants to take his trusty slingshot with him and a deeply held conviction that he fights in the name of and with the power of God. And sure enough, with one well-armed shot, David fells Goliath. Now, don't you feel good about a story where the underdog wins? Now, one of my favorite stories is the movie Hoosiers. This movie depicts, it's a true story, based on a true story, from a high school basketball team in Indiana back in the 1950s. It was a rural team from a rural community. And remarkably, they make it to the state championship game. Now, in one scene, the players enter the arena where the game's going to be played, and they're instantly intimidated by the size of it. They're used to playing in those small gyms with maybe a couple hundred people there, and this arena seats thousands. So their coach takes out a tape measure and has the players measure the distance from the foul line to the basket. And then they measure the height of the basket from the rim down to the floor. And sure enough, the court has the exact same dimensions as the courts that they've practiced on and played on and won on all season. The story of David and Goliath makes sense of a senseless situation. Those who first wrote down the stories of King David, including this story of David and Goliath, did so around the 6th century BC, when the Israelites had been driven into exile, driven from their land, their homes had been destroyed. And these accounts were written for a community that was in total despair. of people who were trying to figure out how in the world things had gone so wrong. They're wondering what the future could hold and where was God during these terrible events. To answer these questions, the scribes describe the scene. The giant Goliath threatens to make mincemeat of the Israelites and to take them as the Philistines' slaves. But the Israelites have been there before and done that. They know all about a life of slavery, and they are desperate to avoid it. But they're also terrified because they know there is no Israelite that can match up with Goliath and win. There isn't even anyone willing to try. So there they wait, doing nothing, trying not to antagonize the enemy. They seem to think that if they hold very still, maybe, just maybe, Goliath and his army will give up and go away. But they don't. King Saul and his army can only see two options. Send someone to go battle Goliath, which means that they would all end up slaves to the Philistines, or do nothing and hope the Philistine army will just get bored and leave them alone. Morale is low. They are paralyzed by fear. But when this shepherd boy David arrives, he offers a whole new perspective. From the moment he sizes up the scene, David is the only one there able to remember the most important thing of all. The thing all these well-armed soldiers had forgotten. That they are the people of the living God. And that these soldiers are the army of God. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of Moses. The God who rained down plagues on the Pharaoh and parted the sea so the Israelites could walk on dry land while Pharaoh's army drowned behind them. The God who brought people through the wilderness and into the promised land. David refuses to let Goliath and his size and strength and threats define him or his people. For the Israelite army, Goliath and the fear that he invoked in them had become the center of their universe, the most important thing in their lives. They could do nothing but watch and listen to every move he makes and every word he says. But David shows them, and us, a different way. And God knows from time to time, we all need to be shown a different way. Because we let the Goliaths take over our lives. We all have things we fear. Illness, addiction, loneliness, failure, financial ruin, or some secret that we can't even share. And those fears grow bigger and bigger and bigger until they hijack our imagination, our ability to envision a future beyond the challenges of today. Not only that, but our fears have a way of overwhelming our ability to remember the presence of God, the love of God. The story of David and Goliath answers an existential question, a question that every individual, every community, every nation, even every church faces from one time or another. What do we do when fear overshadows hope? What do we do when it looks like promises made to us, or even promises we made ourselves, might not be kept? What do we do when it feels like everything we hold dear is falling apart? What David did when he came face to face with Goliath was remember what he already knew deep within his soul, that God is faithful, that God is present, that God equips us for the task at hand. David remembered God. David knew that he did not need someone else's armor to do what he did best. He simply needed to choose a stone from the river and to send it flying. When faced with our fears, it's so easy to let them take over, to let them define us. When that happens, we tend to make things more complicated than they need to be. When what we really need to do is remember the basic things about who we are and whose we are. We are the beloved children of the living God, whose claim on us and whose love for us is stronger and deeper than any fear that threatens to overwhelm us. And that allows David to do what no one else there could do. While David makes it look so easy to bring down a giant, we need to remember also that David's life, while full of triumph and accomplishment, will not, in the end, be defined by his successes. He will show himself to be utterly human, terribly flawed, and defined by his desperate need of God's guidance, God's grace, God's promises, and God's love, just like each of us. That's why those who wrote down David's story from a place of exile made sure that this story, the one where the shepherd boy takes down the mighty giant, comes right at the beginning of the stories of David. Because David will not be the underdog for long. There'll come a day when David will forget what defines him most fundamentally is his relationship with God. There will come a time when David's imagination will be dominated by fear and lust and greed and doubt. But perhaps because this childhood story of taking down Goliath remains, David, even in his most unsavory moments, eventually remembers and shows us what is most important. That though we may turn from God, God never turns from us. We learn this in a new way in the life, the death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Jewish prophet from the line of King David. Like David, Jesus shows us what we need to move beyond our fear and into the future that God has prepared for us. As uncertain as that future may be, as much as we might fear the change that it requires, what we know for certain is that God is with us every step of the way. After all, this is the God who, in the words of Israel's extraordinarily human king, leads us beside still waters, walks with us in life's darkest valleys, and nourishes us with a heavenly banquet when God brings us home. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.